You fool! Warren is dead. Something Toothsome and Others. 4 horror stories by Arthur J. Burks. Something Toothsome by Arthur J. Burks. 2 officers of widely different interests and professions faced each other across a desk in the Naval Hospital, looking animatedly into each other's faces by the light that came down to them from the single droplight over the desk. One of the men was young, of Nordic type, with most of his life yet before him. He had too much imagination. He thought he could write and was forever looking for plot material. The other man had spent as much time in the service as the younger had spent in the world. He was a dental surgeon, and a good one. He likewise had imagination, and would have been a writer had he been less indolent. He never missed an opportunity of discussing stories and story builders. 2.5 Striper Danvers, dental surgeon extraordinary, and Wade Alexander, lieutenant of Marines, had found something in common and never missed a chance for discussion. When it happened that Danvers was medical officer of the day on the same date when Alexander was officer of the day at the barracks, there was invariably an after-sundown meeting in the offices of the former. This was such a meeting, and both parties to it were waxing warm. "But where in the devil do you find anything about which to write?" demanded Danvers. "I'm a dentist, and all I can think of is teeth. Stories about teeth will never pay your dental work. Not that I couldn't write reams about 'em." "Then why don't you write about them, turning your experiences into fiction?" "It can't be done. Merely the mention of dental offices or dentists is enough to scare out most people, especially if they have had experience with either one or the other." Just then a corpsman entered the office, calling Dr. Danvers to the main office telephone several doors away. The surgeon excused himself and hurried out. While he was away, the young lieutenant looked casually down at the top of the desk against which he was leaning. On a paper just under his hand lay an object that attracted his attention at once. It was rather small, and Alexander thought at first that it was a plaster cast of a baby's foot. He lifted it and turned it over. Then he noticed that it was a white plaster model of the upper right jaw of a human being, as if a piece had been cut out between where the wisdom tooth comes in and where a line drawn straight down from the bridge of the nose would cross the mouth. Teeth and gums were perfectly reproduced, except as to color. As the surgeon's stay in the other office was prolonged by the wordiness of the person who had rung him up, Alexander's face began slowly to take on that look of interest which is the heritage of the person who is forever on the trail of good story material. He turned the little model slowly in his hand. When the dental surgeon finally returned, Alexander was smiling. "Look here, Commander," he said. "Here is a story right under your eyes, and you haven't seen it. Look at this model which I hold in my hand." "I see it," replied Danvers dryly. "Fact is, I made the blame thing. It is a model of Mrs. Parrish's right upper jaw. Models are common in dental offices." "Yes, but there is a story here too, I think. First, let me ask you a question. Has dentistry reached that stage of development in which a good dental surgeon could tell the difference between the tooth marks of a human being and those of, say, an ape?" "Certainly. The veriest novice could tell the difference at a glance, by the spacing of the teeth, shape of the imprint, and so on. Take a handful of human teeth, for example, and mix them up helter-skelter. Hold them out to me, and I can tell you where each tooth belongs in the human jaw as fast as you can point out the teeth you wish named." "Could you tell the difference between the tooth marks of a Cro-Magnon man and those of a man of today?" "I believe. Nay, I am certain that I could." "All right, then. Here is the germ of your story. Say that a man who had an enemy, whom he wished to put out of the way, was possessed of a model of the upper right jaw of a Cro-Magnon man. Suppose that this fellow killed his man with some kind of poison that leaves scarcely a trace. Prussic acid, for example. Even if a good medical man could find a trace of poison in the stomach of the dead man, do you suppose he would even look for it if he saw the deep black and blue marks of human teeth on the dead person's throat? No, indeed. He would look for a human fiend who made his kill with his fangs like an ape. But he, knowing that teeth could be identified, would soon learn that the marks were not those of an ape, but of a human being. But after classifying the marks, he finds that the marks are of teeth such as are not found in the world today. He is up against a puzzle. Suppose one adds to the puzzle by having the marks be those of the upper right jaw only, and only a blur, a bluish bruise where the rest of the teeth should have sunk home in the throat of the victim. What then? Has the killer held something in his mouth which took up the prints of the teeth without reducing the pressure on the murdered person's throat? Or has he made his kill in some other way, and marked the throat of his victim with a model such as this one, by way of a blind, pressing the model home with his foot or the flat of his hand? There is where the story builder makes his living, by working out the puzzle. I have given you the germ. Can you complete the story? The dental surgeon looked at his brother officer in horror, and no small amount of admiration. Well, he replied slowly, perhaps I might be able to do so, given time to mull it over, supposing that someone knew that the killer had a model of a Cro-Magnon upper jaw. That's out. Not permitted. Then I suppose I should be compelled to find my man. Exactly. And when you found him, you would have a story to tell to your grandchildren. Both officers looked up as a chorus of sighs came from the open doorway of the office. Watching them were 4 or 5 corpsmen who had listened to every word that had been spoken and were just expressing their relief that their superiors had not been discussing an actual case. Even they had been gripped by the possibility of the plot germ. Danvers waved them away and arose from his chair. Alexander accepted the move as a dismissal. He walked from the office and stood in the outer doorway for a second, looking out into the night. Something at the edge of the pathway of light caught his attention, and held it. Then he sprang back inside and gripped Danvers by the arm. Alexander was trembling like a leaf. "My God, Danvers!" he exclaimed, forgetting in the excitement of the moment the courtesy to his superior. "Did you see that? Right out there, just within the glow of light from the doorway, I saw the most hideous face I've ever seen on a human being. The whole side of its face was gone. Whoever it was, he was standing in the darkness, but he was leaning forward so that his face was full in the light as he peered directly toward the two of us. I know it was a man all right, and I would know that face again in 1,000. Who was he? Why don't you go out and see? You imaginative fellows see too many things that aren't really there." Stung by the sarcasm, Alexander plunged out of the doorway. 10 minutes later, he was back in the dental office to tell Danvers what he had learned, which was nothing at all. He had seen but one person, the senior corpsman, and hadn't heard a single unusual sound. He had greeted the corpsman casually in passing. There was nothing wrong with the corpsman's face. "But I am sure that I saw it," he insisted to Danvers. Alexander was still a bit shaken. "Go back to your office and sleep on the matter," said his superior kindly. "Tomorrow you will be satisfied that your imagination has been running away from you. I know every man in the post, and there isn't anything hideous about one of them, and outsiders can't pass the sentries after nightfall." Alexander took his departure, but he couldn't get that apparition out of his mind. When he finally fell asleep, it was to dream of a bodiless head and a weird face, a face from which the whole right jaw was missing. He awoke with a start 2 or 3 hours before daylight. He had felt that someone had been in his room just an instant before he had awakened. Had he merely dreamed that he had seen that weird face flash for an instant across his window? He walked over and leaned out, looking to right and left. All that he could see clearly was a ridge of concrete running parallel with the building, between which building and ridge was an open space about 1 yard wide, in which the commanding officer expected to plant flowers. This ridge was about 6 inches in height, and a barefooted person could have run along it in either direction without a sound and without leaving a footprint. Thus thought Alexander. He was positive he had seen that face at the window. Or had he dreamed it? The telephone rang so insistently as to startle Alexander half out of his wits. He knew before he answered it that something terrible had happened. "This is the senior dental corpsman speaking, sir," came a voice that quivered with excitement and dread. "Commander Danvers is dead, sir. I am sure he has been murdered." 5 minutes later, Alexander, fully dressed, stood in the office he had quitted but a few hours before, and gazed down upon all that was mortal of Commander Danvers. The dentist lay in the narrow service bunk, flat on his back, arms flung wide. The bed-clothing was dyed with crimson stains. There was a hint of froth on Danvers's lips, and his eyes were wide open, protruding, staring up at the vaulted ceiling, which they never would see again. Alexander looked steadily down at the corpse. Then his face went grey with horror. For, on the white neck of Dr. Danvers, above the jugular vein, were the teeth marks of a human being, and the only marks distinguishable as teeth marks were those of a right upper jaw. There was naught but a livid bruise where the other mark should have been, a bruise that resembled the teeth marks of nothing in the world, just a blue, swollen blot, as if a model had been tramped or pressed into the throat so deeply that the mark of the pressing agency could be seen. Alexander raised his head and looked at the corpsman. Every corpsman on duty in the hospital stood inside the office, each with his back to a door or window, and each with an automatic pistol in his hand, pointed directly at Alexander himself. "What does this mean?" demanded Alexander hoarsely. "It seems strange," replied the senior corpsman, "that the very thing happened to Dr. Danvers that happened to the supposed victim in your little outline to Dr. Danvers himself only a few hours ago. You have much to explain, sir. Why did you come back and kill him like that?" "But I didn't." Alexander almost screamed it. He saw 5 hands tighten on as many automatics at his vehemence. "Danvers was alive when I left here," he continued, "and the sergeant of the guard knows that I haven't left my office since then." "He knows, perhaps," replied the corpsman, "that you never left by way of the door, but we all know that there is a rear window to the office of the officer of the day, and it is almost always open. You could easily glide out and back in again, with no one the wiser." Alexander realized then the terrible predicament in which he found himself. He was compelled, under the mute threat of 4 automatics, to stand by, while the corpsman called the commanding officer by telephone and arranged for Alexander's relief, explaining why in detail. Hanging up the receiver, the corpsman announced that another officer would come immediately to the camp to relieve Alexander. A half-hour later, moving as one in a daze, he turned his sword over to his relief and marched ahead of that officer to the brig, where he was confined in the dark cell, awaiting the morrow's hearing and the result of the inquest. He sat out the remainder of the night there, trying to think it all out. Had he crept from that rear window in his sleep and committed that terrible deed? He had dreamed of worse horrors that night. Had he lived them without knowing it? The last thing that had been called to his attention by the corpsman was that same plaster model about which he had woven the story he had told to Commander Danvers. The model had been stained with blood. There had been real blood on the neck of Dr. Danvers. Alexander had seen the blood himself. Besides these mental shadows, which filled the dark cell as Alexander sat there, was the recollection of that terrible, bodiless face, minus the upper right jaw. Or was it the left, which he had seen at the edge of the light path from the open door of the dental office? Was there any connection? Alexander could see no light ahead. He saw only shadows of uprights, crossbar and hangman's noose, and the shadows of horror that abode with him in the dark cell. The inquest was a hurried one, and every detail of the night's happenings was raked out and scrutinized by the board, from Alexander's ridiculous story to the killing of Danvers. Danvers had been poisoned, and this brutal mark made upon him as if in terrible irony. But there was new testimony. Alexander's shoes were muddy halfway to the insteps, and there were marks of his shoes in the damp earth below the officer of the day's room, a trail through a section of soft earth where, all the preceding day, water sprinklers had been busy dampening the ground for the planting of grass and flowers. The trail led directly to the dental office, and there were marks on the concrete walk where he had stopped and stamped some of the mud off his shoes. Even if Alexander could prove that he had moved in his sleep, he was ruined forever as far as his beloved service was concerned. He was weighed down with utter hopelessness, which was noted officially by the Board of Inquest. It was unfortunate indeed that neither Alexander nor any member of that board was able to see into the room occupied by the senior corpsman that night after the inquest. Had they done so, they would have seen the corpsman do a strange and horrible thing there in the solitude of his room. The corpsman had entered his room, closed and locked the door, gone to the mirror that hung on a wall, and addressed his reflection thus. "Well, Danvers," he said musingly, "I guess we're square now. I wonder, when Alexander told that story of his, if you recalled a certain day some 15 years ago, when I was a humble apprentice working under your supervision. How I bungled an important case and you knocked half my face off with your fist. You covered yourself then by lying. Your word was better than mine, and you went free. But even out of the service, and with the passing of the years, I never forgot. How could I, with half my face gone because of your brutality? The war did many things for surgery, and I was made over after a fashion. You didn't remember me when I came back to you as corpsman. The devil protects his own, I guess. He even sent Alexander to show me the way out. Alexander's story with my variations. The poor fool was rolling on his bed and raving to himself when I sneaked in and stole his shoes. And when I returned them later, pretty slick, I'll say. Putting that blood on the model was fortunate, a masterpiece. Any good doctor would know at once that the poison in Danvers' system was inert. Fortunate for me, too, continued the thing, that Alex thought it was the right side of that apparition's face that was gone, instead of the left. Shows what imagination will do to a smart man's mind. The corpsman grinned horribly to himself, but that grin was an angelic smile compared to the grin that the corpsman achieved a moment later, after he had slid his hand into his mouth and literally pulled his right upper jaw out of that mouth. His face then was a mask even more hideous than the bodiless, jawless shadow that Alexander saw always, there in the darkness of his little cell, the shadow that was to stay with him as long as he lived. Then the corpsman slid the false work back into his mouth and grinned anew, another man and another face. Then, reaching in his pocket, he drew a square piece of ordinary cardboard forth and gazed at it. Upon its surface was the print of the other teeth that should have shown on the throat of the murdered man, and would have shown there too, had the corpsman not held that cardboard between the teeth and Danvers's throat. Slowly chuckling to himself, the corpsman tore the cardboard into little bits, made a pile of the pieces, and touched a match to the result. Neither Alexander nor any member of the inquest saw this, as I said before, but the very officer of the day who had relieved Alexander per arrangement of the corpsman was just passing the window outside, after having visited his sentries. He saw and understood what he did not hear. A smile of satisfaction shone on his face as he glided away from the window to take the story to Alexander, and to make ready the cell for a new occupant. Vale of the Corbies. My fear is an intangible fear, yet to me it is terribly real. Reason tells me that my experiences are but the figments of realistic nightmares, while my inner consciousness tells me that what I have gone through has been something more than disordered imagining. I know in my mind that it has all been a dream or a series of dreams. Yet how can I explain to myself those strange red dots on my hands, my face, my neck? These are very real. They are not hallucinations, for such of my friends as still come to see me at intervals have noted the dots and remarked upon their peculiar appearance. This fact it is that is slowly but surely driving me to the very door of the insane asylum. Damn it, I know they have all been dreams. Yet dream creatures do not leave their marks upon the body of the dreamer. But I had best go back and tell it all from the beginning. I believe that from childhood I dreamed at intervals, widely spaced intervals, of a little secluded valley which had no location except in the recesses of my subconscious mind. It has always been a sunless valley, with a dark cloud hiding the sun. Miasmatic mists have hung like airy shrouds in the still air above the valley's floor. There has been no breeze in this valley, nor anything that lived or moved. The air has been good, freighted with a musty kind of perfume that has ever tantalized my sensitive nostrils. But it has always been air with a strange sort of chill to it that has ever caused me to waken shivering from my dream. I have called the place a valley, yet I do not know for sure that it is a valley, since only my imagination has walled the valley in. It is as though somewhere beyond the mist and the black cloud there were a circle of high hills which I cannot see, just beyond the reach of my vision. Always, in my dream, I enter the valley through a narrow cleft in the walls of stone. I know it is a cleft, though I have never seen the walls, for countless times have I believed that by putting forth my hands I could have touched the walls on either hand, and I have always feared to put forth my hands, lest they encounter nothingness, and this knowledge of nothingness where I'd expected walls might cause my mind to collapse with thoughts of wide immensities or caverns, bottomless, on my right hand and on my left. I prefer not to know the truth, or to delude myself with the knowledge that there may be walls when possibly there are none at all. Straight through this cleft I go, until my sensitive feelings tell me that I have entered the valley. Then begin my strange sensations. First, there is a terrible feeling of loneliness, a feeling of great space all about me, a sense of surrounding desolation which my eye cannot see, and over all a silence that is as heavy as a giant's cloak upon the shoulders of a mere boy. There is the inevitable chill in the air which causes me to shiver, even though, as is sometimes the case when I have dreamed of entering the valley swiftly, with much exertion, my body is bathed in perspiration. Quietly, lest I disturb the eerie atmosphere of the place, I seat myself, cross-legged, upon the ground, and almost at once the queer noises begin to be heard. Always, until a few weeks ago, the noises have been the same, never varying from dream to dream, which, during the passing of the years, have occurred so frequently that the dreams seem to blend into one long nightmare that has no end. What are the noises? They are the beating in the air about me of silken invisible wings. Yet until a few weeks ago I had never seen the creatures whose wings I had heard. Out of the misty distances they come, those wings that whir in the air, those creatures that always swerve and dart hither and yon, ever just far enough within the mist that I cannot see the creatures themselves. When I remember hearing the wings the first time, I am sure there was but one pair of them. Out of the mist they came whirring, and I heard them slap smartly as the creature who travelled upon them, sensing my presence perhaps, stayed its flight and darted back into the fog, only to return a few seconds later, slapping its wings together smartly, ere it darted back and was lost. When the dream came again, and this second time I was several months older, it was repeated in all its details as I have outlined it above, except that now there were two creatures instead of one. Distinctly, while I held my breath to listen, came the whirring of two pairs of wings. Still the creatures were invisible, though I knew from the sound that they were probably identical in shape and kind. Out of the fog they would come, whirring, pausing while their wings beat a startled tattoo in the mists as their flight was stayed. For a number of times, whose exact count I have long since forgotten, the dream was repeated at intervals, which, as I grew older, came closer and closer together. The details never varied except in one particular. The beating of the wings was greater in volume with each succeeding occurrence of the nightmare. First, there had been one pair of wings, then two, then four, ever increasing in numbers until the air all about me, ever beyond my vision, was alive with invisible creatures whose wings whipped the air, caused the fog to swirl eerily, creating a medley of noise that became shortly a continual sound of beating wings, as though the creatures were advancing from the mists in companies and battalions, in regiments and brigades. One group would rush upon me and retire, only to give place to another group which charged me, only to retreat. How many minutes, hours, or days I remained in the valley with its unseen walls, I have no way of computing. But this I know well. After the first time or two, the sound as of wings beating never paused from my entry to the valley until the dream ceased, and I awoke in my bed beneath the eaves at home, with a cold perspiration bathing my body clammily. And here is another weird circumstance. Even though I know in my dream that it is a dream, even though I know as I travel through the cleft what I shall experience when I have reached the valley at last, I am never able to cause myself to waken, nor am I able to cause the dream to change until it has gone through to its usual conclusion. As I traverse the cleft, I try to stay my steps, try to face about and return, but find myself powerless to do so. Always I must go on, until I have entered the valley and listened to the rustling and beating of the invisible wings. Is it any wonder that I have come to fear the approach of nightfall? Is it any wonder that I watch the sun with dread as it slopes down the sky into the west? Is it any wonder that I walk the floor of my study until far into the night, fighting sleep until, from very weariness, I cease to struggle and my eyes close of their own accord? Is it any wonder that a fever has entered my blood, crimsoning my cheeks until I appear like a man far gone in consumption, until the flesh has shrunken on my face so that, except for the roses of fever, my facial appearance is that of a cadaver? Too much worry and fear because of a tiresome nightmare, you say? A nightmare that comes because I fear that it will come, and so fearing bring on the very dream I dread? If it were only the beating of the wings! But many months have passed now since it was only the wings that frightened me. Months, did I say? Months it is, yet it seems that whole years have passed. For one night, when I dreamed, straining my eyes to make out the creatures whose wings I heard, I saw a black blotch against the misty wraiths of the valley. A blotch no bigger than a man's head. The blotch was black, I say, blacker even than the raven tresses of midnight. Just a glimpse it was. A glimpse that chilled me even as the dread coldness of the valley had never done. For there was a definite shape to that black blotch, a shape that spelled, to my disordered imagination, but one thing, that of a vampire bat with a death's head. I waited, my heart in my mouth, for the shape to show itself again. Shortly then I saw it, and knew that the creature I saw was not the same which I had first glimpsed. The outline was the same, but there was an indefinable, inexplicable difference which told me that this second glimpse was of a different creature, twin perhaps of the first. But why continue? Night after night it was the same, until, mingled with the never-ending whirring of the silken wings, I stared, mute with a nameless fear, at a veritable wall of black, darting creatures, a wall that came toward me like a flood of blackness, like a sea of ebon smoke, a wall that was alive, that swirled and eddied, writhed and twisted, pouring in, over and down upon itself, like heavy opaque oil in ferment. Then came the other sound, a raucous croaking which told me what manner of creature it was that showed such interest in me. These creatures were not bats, but birds of ebon blackness, birds that cause their wings to whir tirelessly, birds that increase with the speed of thought, birds that gave voice to raucous croakings that grated against the eardrums, as the rasping of a file grates against an exposed nerve. The birds were Corbies, the birds were ravens. But did the knowledge ease the feeling of tension which night by night seemed to clasp me the tighter? No, no, no. Imagine it if you can. Try mentally to experience it but once. then multiply that experience by all the countless times that I, dreaming my ever-recurring dream, entered the Vale of the Corbies and listened to the beating of their wings, to their perpetual croaking, and watched them writhe and twist in the air, so many in number that their evolutions made one think of a sea of plastic ebony. Do this, and you know why I fight the descent of sleep as I would fight the temptations of Satan. Yes, it is but a dream after all. But is it? It is only 2 weeks ago now that, for the first time, I found myself unable to listen, undisturbed, to the beating wings of the Corbies. For, as they were emboldened, no doubt, by my motionless attitude, the natural fear of me which the creatures must have felt began to disappear. I knew it certainly, when I noted that the black wall of the darting birds had approached closer to me on all sides, had approached so close that I could feel the breeze caused by the wings, could feel the coolness on my cheeks. Then I knew, with a suddenness which had the force of some eerie inspiration, that the chill along my spine which I had always experienced had had a definite cause, and that cause was the antagonism which the Corbies felt toward me. Don't ask me why, for I do not know. Yet what happened afterward proves to me that I am correct in this surmise. From the very first, the Corbies of the Hidden Valley hated me with a hatred which nothing in the world could quell. Why then, did they not, in all their countless numbers, overpower me like a resistless flood and smother me with the very weight of their numbers? Something held them back. Was it the antagonism which I instinctively fostered within myself as a weird sort of protection? Perhaps. Then could these creatures have been creatures of flesh and blood? Or is it only creatures of the astral world that can sense these emanations? Have I not insisted that it is nothing but a never-ending dream? But wait! 2 nights later, when the wall approached quite too closely, I could stand it no longer. With a cry of anger, a cry that was pregnant with fear and a nameless horror, I leaped to my feet and, for the first time, took active steps against the black creatures which were robbing me of what little reason I still possessed. I rushed pell-mell, my eyes closed tightly, into the thick of the wall of flying Corbies, striking out on all sides with clenched fists. I felt my fists strike home in soft, feathery bodies, felt the bodies fall away from my hands. I gathered the creatures in armfuls to my breast, crushing out their little lives against my own body, and fiercely gloated in my power to do them injury. But what were those little stabs of pain which I felt on my exposed hands, my face, and my neck? I felt them, but at the time did not realize their significance. Finally, exhausted from my battle against these terrific, somehow intangible odds, I fell back from the fight and sank again to the ground. But fast between my 2 palms, I held a single one of the ebon ravens. He was still alive, and his little eyes seemed to stare into my own with an expression of saturnine, undying hatred, as though he dared me to hurt him. For many minutes I looked into the eyes of the weak, defenseless bird. Unblinking, he stared back at me, unafraid. Slowly, his mouth opened, as though he sneered at me. Still with his eyes staring into mine, the raven ducked its head suddenly and drove its pointed bill deep into the flesh of my hand. The blood spurted from the wound. Then I knew the meaning of those stabs of pain I had felt when I had fought against the vanguard of the Corbies. The other birds, too, had driven their sharp bills into my flesh. I stared wonderingly at my hands, my attention drawn more closely, because the bird between my palms had pierced the flesh, and as I saw the countless punctures, I knew that what I had thought to be perspiration bathing my cheeks was not perspiration, but blood which the ravens had drawn. What did I do then? Deliberately, not knowing why, just as a small boy does not know why he takes pleasure in being cruel to animals, I looked back at the bird and into its challenging eyes. Then, holding it fast in one hand, with the other I slowly twisted the ebony head from the creature's shoulders and hurled it into the mists. The little body in my hand did not quiver, did not move once after I had cast the head free. But when I had hurled the body after the head, it suddenly seemed to come to life, jumping here and there as does any bird which has been beheaded. Then, upright on its 2 feet, it darted into the fog. but before it had entirely disappeared, I saw it take wing and rise into the air. My God, what ghastly croaking then came from the billow upon billow of Corbies which still circled about me. I pressed my hands to my ears to prevent my eardrums from bursting. Then, when I could stand no more, I leaped to my feet and started back the way I had come, while the ravens followed behind me, raucously croaking their wordless anger. I felt them on my shoulders and on my head. I felt them about my legs, retarding my retreat. I felt the slapping of their wings against my unprotected cheeks and face, felt the sharp stabs of pain in my flesh as their savage bills were plunged home, and awoke in my bed at home with perspiration beading my body. It was perspiration too, not blood, but on my hands, face, and neck there were many, many little red dots, dots which might have been tiny wounds that had healed, leaving fiery weals where the open wounds had been. This, then, is why I fear sleep. When I sleep, I dream. And when I dream of the Vale of Corbies. And I know that, sooner or later, the ravens will slay me. Yet a man cannot fight sleep forever, though for over a week I have not closed my eyes. I have imbibed strong coffee, fiery hot and black as the wings of the ravens. I have used many kinds of drugs, increasing the doses swiftly until I used more than any confirmed fiend that ever lived. Yet I feel myself growing weaker hour by hour, and know that soon I must sleep. And when I do... I, Hans Goodman, brother of the man who wrote the above manuscript, must finish the story, for my brother is dead. What he saw beyond the veil of sleep I do not know. Assuredly I do not believe all that he has written above, because I know that it was written in a fevered frenzy, was born of a mind that had been crazed by drugs and loss of sleep. Call it an insane obsession, if you like. But I found my brother dead in a chair in his study, his body literally covered with the blood which oozed from countless little wounds in his flesh, flesh that, between the wounds, was red with the roses of fever, or red because it had been beaten and pounded by something that was still not powerful enough to break the skin. And who shall say that whirring wings did not paint those roses there, whirring wings that beat an endless tattoo? Church in the Jungles. I harbored no fear of the supernatural. There was more than enough nature around me of which to be afraid. I had roamed into the central Brazilian jungle south of Belterra that morning. I had lost my party. I had played the fool, as so many adventurers did. I had left my outfit to search the woods myself. They were all armed. I was not. I did not believe in firearms. I didn't even carry a stick to smash snakes. I knew it was possible, even with a compass, to lose myself within 100 yards of the camp. I did just that. When darkness fell, terror rode me. I was not afraid of animals particularly. There was a possibility of being bitten by snakes, and I had had narrow escapes, but the balance of chance was against it. The other animals of the forest, the jaguar, ocelot, the great otter, gave man a wide berth. Other men had vanished into the jungles to be seen no more, but I felt pretty sure that one of two things had happened to them. They had been shot by Indians or stepped into holes. There was one other possibility. Animals sometimes broke off tops of shrubs, leaving spine-sharp points which hardened to rock-like consistency. If one fell on one of those points, it would be like Saul falling upon his sword. There were no Indians anywhere near Belterra that one needed to fear. Hadn't been for 50 years, maybe longer. My dread was holes. The jungles were filled with them. When it rained heavily, water stood in low places. Then the bottom fell out of such pools, literally. I had almost stepped into holes 10, 12, 15 feet deep, and every one had been man-size. A man could step in, but without help he would never be able to get out of the hole. That was my principal dread when night caught me. I yelled. I was too far away even for the dogs to hear me. I yelled myself hoarse. I knew that the wise thing was to sit down and wait for morning. My comrades would expect me to do that. Then I'd be trailed and collected. I did sit down for a few minutes, but it takes a man with grim determination to sit quietly through the hours in the Brazilian jungles. So many things crawl, sniff, rattle the leaves, chitter, twitter, flutter invisible wings. Limbs break with sounds like pistol shots. It could be jaguar, tapir, the great otter. That sound could be the socorrijo, the python, creeping up to drop coils around one. No, the holes were preferable. Besides, walking in the dark, one could always slide the feet, test each spot before setting the foot down. In any case, one moved. I walked, sometimes bumping into the thick trees, sometimes putting my extended hands against spined palms. Occasionally, 100 feet aloft, a star peered through a space in the wind-whispering crown to see how I was making out. I yelled again. Nobody answered, but shortly after that I saw the lantern. It gave me a queer feeling, for we had no lantern with us. Back at camp, there was just the usual fire to keep off the jaguar, or to keep him warm if he wasn't afraid of fire. I don't believe in the supernatural, but I was thrilled a little anyway. I knew, if my Brazilian friend spoke truly, that there was nobody in our strip of jungle but us. I moved slowly, carefully, sliding my feet toward the lantern. As I went, I remembered a tale told last night of a haunted jungle church, occasionally reported by wanderers down the centuries. It wasn't in any given place. It just appeared when a wanderer was afraid, or approaching dangerous trouble, and somehow saved him. A ghostly priest, the tale said, signaled the wanderer with a swinging lantern. That lantern was real enough. I stepped into mud over my shoe-tops. I moved to the right, then to the left. I was on the edge of a swamp, I decided, and the lantern was out in it somewhere. That was really odd. It carried coincidence a bit further than most people would accept, for the ghost church always appeared on some safe, sound, high place in a swamp. There would be a way out to the lantern, a causeway of some kind. That's what the tale said, and common sense seemed to indicate the possibility. Ghost or real, the lantern swinger had got out there somehow. I found the causeway, a natural series of hummocks grown together, angling, twisting out into the swamp. There was no doubt now about it being swamp. I heard alligators grunt, lash their tails on the water. I didn't know whether to be glad or sorry I could not see. I did see red eyes, 2 by 2, watching me. Some of them came close, paralleling my course, but the causeway rose beyond their reach. I could see a priest now, holding the lantern high. I called to him, and he made some sort of answer which I could hear but not understand. I saw a building behind him. I could see its door, and well inside the door, candles. I reached the priest, scarcely knowing whether to laugh hysterically or take this all as a matter of course. I put forth my hand to grasp his, but whether by accident or design, he evaded my handshake, bowing slightly. He wasn't Brazilian, but German, I thought, or maybe American. There were German and American Franciscans in the valley of the Tapajos River, of which this uninhabited area was part. The priest indicated that I was to pass through the door. I understood then why speech was taboo. Some sort of ritual was in progress, solemn devotions. The priest signaled me to benches to my right as I entered. There were other men there, Brazilian and Indian. None of my people were here, however, and nobody turned to look at me. The priest who had signaled me to safety went forward. 2 other priests murmured in Latin at 2 altars to right and left, behind the communion railing. The priest who had awaited my coming proceeded to the higher, central altar. Mass was being read here by 3 priests. Odd, I thought. Down here I had never participated in night mass except at Christmas, but always early in the morning. But I knew little of the priestly craft, though I was not irreligious. The priests were cowled. There were kneeling women behind the benches to the left. Several of them were nuns in black, with black bonnets covering, or at least hiding, their faces. I knelt too, thankful I'd escaped until devotions were ended. Slowly, nuns and two of the priests whom I had not met rose and left the church, hands clasped before them, not looking at me. They had no interest in me. I could not see them too well, for I had been watching the flickering candles which had almost blinded me. The priest, who had doubtless saved my life, was the only one left. He stood before me, smiling. His face was white, beautiful, his teeth perfect. He held the lantern so that I could see his face. He wore brown habit, I noticed, the only one of which I was sure. "We are sorry we have no accommodations for travellers," the priest said to me in amazingly correct English, slowly and precisely, as if he first interpreted from some other language. "There are only ourselves. The sisters have a building out there." He moved his head to indicate outside to the right. "And we have a building on the other side of Egregia Pagida. But you may use my favorite place. Come." I got a slight bang out of his use of the words Egregia Pagida, for that had been the name of the ghost church my comrades had talked about around the campfire last night. Lost Church. The priest, he never gave me his name, led me to a place in the wall of the church where a tree grew right through, or where the church had been built around the tree. Two huge limbs divided there to form an area bed-size, shoulder-high, that did look inviting. "I often meditate there," the priest said. "When there is no sound, alligators sometimes wander into the church. It is also not unknown to the python, but you will be quite safe. We are so poor, there won't even be coffee in the morning." "I'll be fine," I said. I saw one of the nuns, now snuffing the candles. I supposed she was the sacristan. "A night's sleep, and I'll be swell." He stood until I climbed up, sighed, straightened out. He stood until the candles were all snuffed and darkness was complete, save for his lantern. I didn't see what became of the nun. The priest went to the door by which I had entered, raised the lantern, snicked up the chimney, blew out the flame. Utter darkness descended. I had the vaguest idea of the church. Big, I thought. Big, old, falling apart. It had a musty smell. I slept like a log. I wakened with the sun in my face. I sat up in my big crotch of tree, looked around me. There was swamp everywhere. The snouts of many alligators rested on the water, beady eyes watching me, waiting for me to fall. I almost did, when I realized that there was no church, had therefore been no priest, lantern, nuns, candles, altars, incense, or mass. But could I ever be sure of that? How had I got out to my refuge in the blackness of night? That's what my friends asked me when, an hour after dawn, I heard their shouts, answered them, and they came to the edge of the swamp. I could find no way to get out of the swamp. It was 2 hours before they found a way in. Even then, I had great difficulty jumping from hummock to hummock behind them, going out. "How did you get out there?" they asked. "Jumped from back to back of the alligators," I said. "Nonsense." "Well, then, you remember that story you told me about Egregia Pagida? I saw a lantern. A priest was waving it. I simply followed it." I told them exactly what had happened to me. They didn't believe a word of it. It sounded too much like the ghost church tale they had told me the night before. I knew no way to change the story, however. Bells of Oceana. It was on a heavily laden troop ship westward heading. Hours before, the sun had gone down toward China, trailing ebon night behind her. For a full week, since dropping the California coast behind us, there had been nothing in all the wild waste of waters for us to see save ourselves. No ship's funnels broke the lowering horizon, no sign of land, for our skipper had chosen a passage lying somewhere in between the usual steamer lanes. The nearest land, save that which stretched in eternal darkness some 3 miles below us, was more than 1,000 miles beyond the southern horizon. We were just a single ship, burdened with a precious freight of souls, upon an ocean that seemed endless. The first day out had been squally, and everyone had been sick, save those of us who had gone down to the sea in ships before. But with the dawning of the second morning, the sea had calmed down, and our vessel rode through the blue, toward the horizon bowl which ever crept before us in the golden wake of the setting sun. The voyage, if the old salt spoke truly, would be uneventful, but with that strange premonitory feeling which comes to all of us at times, I did not believe them. Something, from the very first, warned me that our voyage was ill-fated. I couldn't explain my feeling. It wasn't a feeling of dread, exactly, nor of fear, just a strange feeling of unease, much like that which comes to people on their first voyage, when a ship is rolling slightly under their feet, and everything, until they get their sea legs, seems strangely out of focus. That doesn't explain it, I know, but it is as near as I can put my feeling into words. I knew, when the sun went down ahead of us, with the 180th meridian less than 24 hours ahead, that we were on the eve of strange, momentous happenings. To add to my feeling of unease, and as though it had been all planned out by some invisible something or somebody, in the vague beginning, the officer who should have had the watch that night fell suddenly ill, and I was called upon to take his place. I knew, as I donned my belt, holster, and pistol, that I but obeyed the will of some invisible prompter, a prompter without a name. We had 7 sentries out at various important places about the ship, and I made the routine inspections before turning in, less than an hour before midnight. When I entered my stateroom and turned on the light, that feeling of unease was more pronounced than it had been at any time previously. I had the feeling, though I had locked my door when I had last quitted my stateroom, that I had entered again immediately after someone had left it. Yet that was impossible. I had carried the key in my pocket all the time, and my cabin boy was not provided with one. There was no way that anyone or anything could have entered my stateroom in my absence, save... Still, as though my every move had been ordered by some invisible prompter, my eyes darted to the porthole beside my bed. It was quite too small for the passage of a human body, and even to think of such a thing were the utmost folly. If anyone had gone out through the porthole, that one had fallen or plunged into the sea, for had the porthole been ever so big, there was absolutely no way one could have left my stateroom by that way and still remained upon the ship, unless that one had gone out and were even now hanging by his hands along the ship's side. So strongly had the feeling of an alien presence obtruded itself upon me that, in spite of knowing myself an utter fool for entertaining any doubt whatsoever, I strode to the porthole and looked out. There was nothing, of course, save water, now black and forbidding, stretching away to the south, to a horizon that, since night had fallen, seemed to have crept quite close to us to watch our passing. Still unsatisfied, in spite of arguing with myself, condemning myself for a fool, I deliberately closed the glass which masked the port, took my seat in a chair beside the bunk, facing the round glass of the porthole, which resembled to an imagination suddenly fevered the eye of a huge one-eyed giant, and began to undress. Mechanically, I lifted first one foot and then the other, removing shoes and stockings. But I kept my eyes upon the closed porthole, and that feeling of an unseen presence in the room was stronger as the moments fled. My undressing completed, I stood erect to turn out the lights, and paused in the very act, a cry of terror smothered in my throat by a sheer act of will. For the most fleeting of seconds, I had seen a dead white face outside the glass which covered the porthole. It was the face of a person who had drowned, I told myself wildly, and the dripping hair wore a coronet of fluttering seaweed. The eyes of this strange outsider stared straight into mine, devoid of expression, totally unwinking, and the lips, which seemed blue as though with icy cold, long endured, smiled a thin and ironic smile. It took all the courage I possessed, which is little enough in the face of the unknown, to hurl myself across the bed, right hand extended toward the heavy screw which held the circular piece of glass in place. In the instant my hand would have touched the glass, the ship rode into the edge of the storm that was to fill the remainder of the night, and the stern of the steamer rose dizzily on the crest of a mighty wave, dragging all the vessel with it, and the face slid slowly out of sight below the porthole, the bluish lips still smiling, ironically. I admit that I was trembling, that my fingers were unsteady as I fumbled with the screw to unloose the glass. When the porthole was open once more, and the cold breeze of this latitude came in to fan my fevered face, I thrust my head out of the port and gazed right and left, and up and down, along the curving side of the ship. But there was nothing, save straight ahead on our port side. And even there was nothing but black water, huge mountainous waves touched with whitecaps at their crests, like flying shrouds or like lacy streamers created as a fringe for the mantle of night. I watched several of the waves sweep under the vessel, which rose and fell sluggishly. The waves seemed to be travelling in no certain direction, but broke into a veritable welter of warring forces, roaring as they came together with the roaring of maddened, deep-throated bulls. Valleys with darkness on their floors, mountain tops touched with snow that shifted eerily in the breeze. I was about to close the port when, many yards away from the ship, as though born of the womb of old ocean, I heard the bells. Like the tiny bells which the bellwether wears to signal the ewes and the lambs, was the tinkling of the bells. Like those bells, yet not like them, totally out of place in mid-ocean, and I felt a strange prickling of the scalp as I listened. Hurriedly, driven by a fear I could not have explained then, nor can I now explain, I closed the porthole again, and whirled about with another scream, which this time came forth from my quivering lips in spite of all I could do to prevent. Just inside my stateroom door stood my sergeant of the guard, and his lips were trembling more wildly than my own. His eyes protruded horribly, his face was chalk white, and he was striving with all his power to speak. As I watched his manful struggle, I dreaded for him to speak, for I knew that what he had come to tell me would be something strange and terrible, something hitherto entirely outside my experience. "Sir," he managed at last, when I stiffly nodded permission for him to speak, "I just made the rounds of the sentries." Here the poor fellow stopped, unable to go on, and his knees knocked together audibly. "Yes, Sergeant," I managed to mutter. "You went the usual rounds of the sentries, and then?" "The sentry who should be on duty on the main deck, forward of the bridge, is missing." Of course, I knew on the instant that there might be many reasons for the failure of the sergeant of the guard to find the sentry, many logical reasons. The sentry might have quitted his post, a violation of regulations, true, for a quiet cigarette in the lee of a lifeboat. He might have been walking his post in the direction taken by the sergeant, so that the latter had not overtaken him. even with a complete circling of the main deck. He might— Oh, there were many logical explanations, but I guessed instinctively that none of these reasons fitted the case. For one thing, the sergeant of the guard was an old-timer, had spent many years of his life at sea, yet he was frightened half out of his wits, and I knew he held as many decorations for bravery as any other officer or man in the Marine Corps. There was something terrible, something, if you will, uncanny behind this disappearance of the sentry. I muttered an oath, more to prod my own flagging courage than for any other reason, and started toward the door, motioning the sergeant to precede me. But he shook his head stubbornly and barred my way. I halted, for it was evident that he had not completed his report. "You'll maybe think me daft," he said, "but I couldn't let you go out there, sir, without telling you everything. The corporal on watch at the head of the promenade gangway told me a strange story just before I made my rounds. He opened the door leading onto the starboard promenade for a look at the weather outside, and just as he was about to close it again, the ship lifted on the crest of a huge wave, and out beyond the wave, many yards away from the ship, he heard something which he likened to the tinkling of little bells." "Good God!" I exclaimed. "And," the sergeant continued, "all the time I was looking for the missing sentry, I had the idea there was someone behind me, following me every step of the way. Yet when I whirled to look, the deck behind me was empty." "And you found no sign of the sentry?" I said stupidly. The sergeant shook his head. "Nothing," he said, Except, well, sir, you'll maybe think me daft, as I said before, but on the spot where the sentry had stood to wait for me on my last round, I found wet marks on the deck floor, the marks, as near as I could tell with my flashlight, of bare feet." Mechanically, as the sergeant spoke, I had been donning my clothes, leaving my shoes, however, unlaced. I felt an icy chill along my spine as the sergeant continued, and I dreaded, as I had never dreaded anything before, to ask him further about those wet footprints on the deck. "The wet footprints," he went on, and he was talking wildly now, his words tripping over one another. So rapidly were they uttered, as though he wished to finish his report before I could interrupt again. "Led away where the sentry should have been standing, straight to the starboard rail. Right at the rail I stooped to examine the prints more closely. They were the footprints of a human being, I was sure, and the marks of the toes were blurred and very wide, as though whoever or whatever had made them had been carrying a burden in his arms." "Good God, Sergeant," I said again. "What are you driving at?" "Just this, sir. There's something terribly wrong with this ship. Something took that sentry bodily over the side." I believe that putting a name, however meaningless, to what was in my own mind, caused a little of my courage to return, for I did not find it difficult now to bring myself to leave the stateroom. The sergeant almost trod on my heels as I hurried to the main deck, starboard side, where the wind wrapped icy fingers around me, chilling me to the bone on the instant. As I hurried forward, I looked over the side into the welter of waters, and stopped short. Behind me the sergeant groaned, hollowly, like a man who has been mortally wounded, for out of the waters, away to starboard, came the sound of tinkling bells. I darted to the rail and leaned far outward, striving to pierce the gloom. But there was nothing, save the watery wastes, mountains and valleys, and two spots of greenish phosphorescence far out, like serpents' eyes which watched the passing ship. But when I looked at them closely, straining my eyes, seeking the form below the eyes, the twin balls of eerie flame vanished, a wall of water obtruding itself between. Well, we found the sentry, sprawled on his face, where the sergeant should have found him on his rounds. I turned the body over, and it was quite cold, with excellent reason. The corpse was dripping wet, entirely nude, and the lips and cheeks as coldly blue as though the corpse had been dragged for hours on a line in the wake of the ship. No matter how secluded one's life may have been, no matter how carefully one may have been guarded during one's lifetime, there come into the lives of most of us certain inexplicable happenings which may never be forgotten. This matter of the dead sentry was one of these for me, and I shall go to my grave with the memory of his cold cheeks and bluish lips limned upon the retina of my very soul. Thank God that, at the moment, I could not look into the 2 hours or more of terror which, even then, stretched before me, else I should most surely have gone entirely mad. So many strange circumstances were there connected with this matter that, taken altogether, it is little wonder that I have been unable to forget or ever shall forget. The roaring of the wind which was lashing all the ocean into fury, a maelstrom in mid-ocean, ghostly white caps stretching away into darkness, into seeming infinity, the frightened sergeant behind me, his teeth chattering with fear, the dead sentry at my feet, his body blue with cold, entirely nude as I have said, the marks on the deck of huge bare feet, wet as though the feet had come up out of the sea, the eerie sound of bells between our vessel and the lowering horizon, and that dead white face which I had seen beyond the porthole of my own cabin a half-hour before. What was the explanation of it all? What was the cause of the bells, if bells there were? What had come up out of the sea to stride barefooted across the promenade deck of the slumbering troopship? Had my sentry seen whatever had come for him before he had been taken? Add to all these circumstances the fact that all hell was loose in the watery wastes, that it was now after midnight, and you will understand a little of my feelings. Never before or since have I been as frightened as I was then. I don't regard myself as a coward, nor am I ordinarily superstitious. But show me the man who is without fear in the presence of the unknown, the utterly uncanny, and I will show you a man who has no soul. I whirled, bumping into the sergeant, who manfully muffled a scream at my unexpected movement, and started almost blindly toward the stern of the troopship. As I strode along, with the sergeant at my heels once more, strange images fled across my mind. I remembered the tale of De Lorelei, the maiden who lured sailors to their death with her eerie singing, and strained my eyes through the gloom, seeking shapes I feared to see. Then my mind went farther back, to the years before I could read, years in which, thirsty for knowledge, I studied pictures out of old histories to satisfy my longings for wisdom. One of these pictures came back to my mind as I hurried aft. A picture of a hideous monster of unbelievable proportions, who had come up from behind the ocean's horizon, blotting out the sunlight, long arms extended into the picture's foreground, the right hand holding aloft a medieval sailing vessel, which had been lifted bodily from the ocean. A fantastic picture, I knew now, drawn to prove the existence of terrible monsters beyond the horizon to which, as yet, no caravel or galleon had dared travel. I wondered, as I strode aft, why this old picture should return to my mind at this time, and fear was at my throat again as I walked. "I am coming, oh, my beloved!" The words, high-pitched with ecstasy, came from straight ahead of me, and out of the heavy shadow cast by a huge funnel stepped one of my sentries. Just for a second, as he strode toward the starboard rail, I could see his face, and the face was transfigured as though the man gazed into the very soul of the perfect sweetheart somewhere beyond the rail. Slowly, step by step, as though he would prolong the joy of anticipation, the sentry, who had hurled his rifle aside, approached the rail, still with his eyes fixed on the welter of waters overside, while I halted, spellbound, to watch what he would do. From out of the waters there came once more the tinkling of bells, and with the sound, as though the sound had been a signal, a huge shadow detached itself from the shadow whence the sentry had stepped but a moment ago, and loomed high above the luckless youth. At the same time, the ship climbed high upon a monster wave, so that her starboard side went down, down, until white water came over the side, and when she straightened again, shuddering through all of her, the sentry had vanished. From well rearward of where the man had disappeared, from out of the smother of waters, there came a single long-drawn cry, and it was not a cry of terror, not a cry of pain, but a scream of ecstasy. "He's gone, Sergeant," I said stupidly. "But what took him? Not the wave. He had but to seize the rail to save himself." "Did you see the shadow, Lieutenant?" the sergeant replied. I did not answer. He knew I had seen it. We strode on again, heading toward the stern of the ship, and all about us now, over the ship, on either side of her, but never on her, there tinkled the eerie, unexplainable bells. We stood at last in the very stern of the troop ship, gazing into the ghostly wake far below our coign of vantage, and with certain care I followed the wake rearward with my eyes. But one could not follow it far. That was the circumstance which impressed itself upon me almost at once. The wake died away, short off, within less than a dozen yards of the ship's stern, as though at the very moment of birth it had been ignominiously smothered. In a trice I understood the reason, and thought I understood many things besides, for, like a monster raft, stretching away rearward as far as I could see, and into the darkness beyond my vision to right and left, there followed us, close to, an undulating mass of odorless seaweed. Acres and acres of it there were, rising and falling sluggishly, but keeping pace with the troop ship through the night and the storm. Came again that sound of bells, and my hair stiffened at the base of my skull, when I saw, watching the seaweed, the result of the tinkling of the bells. The seaweed, when the bells sounded, seemed imbued suddenly with life that was utterly and completely rampant. Long tendrils of the stuff drew away to right and left below us, as though endowed with will of their own, and these tendrils, countless thousands of them, collided with other tendrils in the mass, and slithered over them so that all the mass of the seaweed writhed as though in torment, resembling countless hordes of serpents gathered together from all the evil places of the earth. And where the tendrils had drawn aside, I could see black water in the rift, as though the tendrils had drawn aside so that I might see. Some terrible fascination held me, my eyes fixed on that space of black water, for several moments after the tendrils of seaweed had drawn away to right and left, and up from the depths into the opening came two who filled all my being with abject terror, and something else. One of the two was dead, I knew on the instant, for I could see his face, all white and drawn, yet with the blue lips smiling, of the ill-fated sentry who had gone over the side before my very eyes, and he had been brought up from the depths in the arms of— I hesitate to give the creature a name. A woman? I scarcely know. Yet this I do know. In the instant I looked into her eyes, raised to mine for a full minute, I understood the ecstasy which I had read in the face of the sentry, whom she now held in her arms. Her breasts, nude and unashamed, were the breasts of a buxom woman, her lips as red as full-blown roses, her hair as black as the wings of a crow, a mantle of loveliness all about her wondrous body, whipping this way and that in the storm. Her eyes swerved away from mine, and one arm, shapely and snowy, raised aloft from the water, and to my ears came again the sound of tinkling bells. Once more the seaweed writhed and twisted, pressed forward about the ship, but a single mass of it detached itself from the larger mass, pressed close to the, should I call her woman, and swerved away again, and the arms of the beautiful creature were empty. Instinctively I whirled about, knowing somehow that I must move my head before I met this creature's eyes again, and stared forward to the shadowy portion of the promenade whence the sentry had emerged before his plunge over the side. Up the starboard side of the ship crept a veritable wall of seaweed, up to the rail, pausing there for a moment, then to the deck, where it writhed for a moment or two, taking a weird, distorted shape that made me think of a man, yet which I knew was not a man, before it strode into the centre of the promenade. From out of the heart of this monstrosity there dropped soggily a white, cold figure. The second sentry had returned, as the first had done. Why? What did all this unbelievable terror mean? I knew, as I searched through all my experience, seeking the key to this uncanny enigma, that we were heading westward outside the usually travelled sea lanes, that ships seldom, if ever, came this way, that in 7 days we had seen not one vessel, nor even the smoke of one upon the horizon. Why did not vessels come this way? But I could not answer my many questions. I could only ask them, and hope within me that they may be not answered ever. Nauseated by the return of the dead sentry, nude as the first had been, I closed my eyes for a moment, and when I opened them again, there was no seaweed, no monstrous shape upon the promenade. But even from where I stood, I could see the wet footprints, and wondered whom next the creature of the deep would claim from aboard our ill-fated vessel. Resolutely I drew my pistol, and returned once more toward the stern of the vessel. This creature of the depths, whatever it was, had taken life twice. Whatever it was mortal, and whatever is mortal a bullet will slay. But in the very act of whirling I stopped short, for between me and the stern of the vessel, smiling dreamily, water rippling over her nude and glorious body to splash upon the deck, stood the creature who had come up from the depths in the wake of the ship, bearing the dead man in her arms. My arm fell to my side, my weapon clattered to the deck, and as I moved forward once more, slowly, a step at a time, as the sentry had done, the wondrous creature held out her dripping arms, and my eyes drank in all the glorious wonder of her, from head to... But she had no feet. Where the feet should have been, and the legs, there were neither legs nor feet, but a scaly column, wet and dripping, like a serpent with a woman's body. I screamed in terror and unbelief, but it was too late, and her arms were about me, preventing all escape. But with the touch of those arms I did not wish to struggle. I knew what had happened to the 2 sentries, knew the same was in prospect for me, yet at the moment there seemed nothing in all the world more worthwhile than to slip over the side, into the depths, with the arms of this wondrous creature about me. "Lieutenant! Lieutenant! For the love of God, what is happening to you?" It was the voice of the sergeant of the guard, frighted with abysmal terror. But I did not care. The shapely, strangely warm arms of the sea creature were about me, and the sound of the bells, unbelievably sweet now, was in my ears. For me the world had ceased to exist, save for knowledge that these 2 things were true. I was carried to the rail, and went over slowly, without commotion, as comfortably as though I had been riding on a couch of eiderdown, and came to myself, to know myself lost indeed. I was deep down, whirling over and over behind the whirling screws of the ship, holding my breath until my lungs were nigh to bursting, swimming with all my might, striving to reach the surface and life-giving air, when I hadn't the slightest idea which way was upward. With all my power I fought toward the surface, but my progress was slow and dragging, for there was a weight about my knees, as though arms were clasped about them, striving to hold me down. A wordless voice was in my ears, begging, beseeching, and there was something in the voice which made my struggles seem foolish and unnecessary, so that I desired never to reach the air I needed. I closed my eyes, which I had opened instinctively upon striking the water, and 2 lips pressed firmly against my own, and those lips saved my life and my reason, for they were the cold lips of a corpse, with neither love nor challenge in them. I flailed out once more, and my hand caught in the line which the steamer dragged over her stern to measure the knots she travelled. All about me as I was hurled forward, now under water, now with nostrils out for a brief breathing space, the mass of seaweed rose and fell on the heavy seas. God knows how I ever got back aboard the troop ship, but I awoke at mess call in the morning and sent immediately for the sergeant of the guard. "What happened after I came back aboard last night, Sergeant?" I asked abruptly. The sergeant of the guard stared at me as though he thought me insane. "I don't understand you," he managed finally. "Have we finally passed through the area of seaweed?" "Seaweed? Is the lieutenant making sport of me? We're 2,000 miles from any land, save the ocean bottom, and there ain't any seaweed anywhere. I don't understand you." "Let it pass," I said. "When did you last visit the sentries last night?" "Just before midnight, sir." "And were all of them at their post of duty?" "Yes, sir." "And what about the bells?" Again, the sergeant's puzzlement was so genuine that I knew he did not understand my meaning. How much of my experience had been real? How much fantasy? I tried another tack. "Did you make a round of the sentries after midnight?" The sergeant shook his head sheepishly. It is one of the rules of guard duty that one visit to all sentries must take place between midnight and morning. "Then the guard hasn't been mustered this morning. Is everyone present? You don't know? Then go at once and find out." 10 minutes later, the sergeant returned, chalk-white of face, to report that 2 of the guard were missing and could not be found anywhere aboard. He told me their names, and instantly my mind went back to the night of uncanny happenings just past, and the 2 nude bodies brought back from the deep in the arms of whom or what? I never knew, and to this day the questions I have propounded have never been answered. But this I know, there are strange things and sounds in the sea near the 180th meridian, 1,000 miles north of Honolulu, and this is the strangest incident in my night of terror. The clothing which I donned next morning was entirely dry, but my hair was stiff with salt water, and there was the tang of seaweed in my room when I awoke. I looked, too, at the glass which covered the porthole beside my bed. Outside that glass were the smudged prints of thin lips, the blur above them which told of a face pressed against the glass from outside, as though somebody or something had tried to peer in between nightfall and morning. And the bells? I still can hear them in memory when sometimes I waken at sea after midnight, and the rolling and the plunging of the ship tell me that a storm is making. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the Join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,